March 1944, Willow Run, Michigan, 30 miles west of Detroit, in the farmland between Ypsilanti and Ann Arbor. Charles Sorensen stood at the end of the mile-long assembly line watching the 387th B-24 Liberator Bomber of the Month roll toward the factory doors, and what he witnessed represented vindication of a claim that aviation experts had dismissed as impossible when he'd first made it 3 years earlier, standing in a California hotel room holding a hand-drawn sketch that outlined how Ford Motor Company would apply automobile mass production techniques to aircraft manufacturing and achieve the unprecedented goal of completing one 4-engine heavy bomber every 60 minutes. The 73-year-old Ford executive had built his reputation implementing Henry Ford's assembly line revolution that had transformed automobile manufacturing from craft production into mass production, had helped create the system that produced 15 million Model T Fords between 1908 and 1927, had developed the manufacturing expertise that made Ford synonymous with American industrial might, and now watched as that expertise achieved what aircraft manufacturers had considered fantasy, when he'd promised to build B-24s at rates that exceeded their entire annual production in a single month. Around him stretched the largest room under a single roof anywhere in the world, 3.5 million square feet of factory floor space, where 42,000 workers on 2 9-hour shifts assembled bombers from components that arrived through a supply network extending to nearly 1,000 Ford facilities and independent suppliers across the United States, creating an industrial ecosystem so vast and coordinated that it represented American productive capacity operating at a scale that Nazi Germany's leadership had never imagined possible when they'd calculated that the United States couldn't mobilize its industry quickly enough to affect the war's outcome before German victory was secured. What Sorensen knew, what the workers assembling bombers around him understood, through months of grinding production that had finally achieved its rhythm after 2 years of struggle and setbacks, was that this factory represented more than just manufacturing achievement, represented instead a transformation in how warfare would be conducted in the industrial age, where victory belonged not just to nations with brave soldiers and brilliant generals, but to nations with factories that could produce weapons faster than enemies could destroy them, where the assembly line became as decisive as the front line, where American workers building bombers in Michigan contributed as directly to Allied victory as American air crews flying those bombers over Germany and Japan. Within the next 2 months, Willow Run would achieve the production rate that Sorensen had promised in December 1940, when skeptical aircraft executives had laughed at his claim that Ford could build 1 B-24 every hour, would produce 453 bombers in 468 working hours during April 1944, would demonstrate that American industrial capacity had reached levels that would overwhelm Axis production and ensure Allied victory not through superior strategy or technology alone, but through sheer volume of weapons that no enemy could match, regardless of how efficiently they organized their own industries or how ruthlessly they exploited conquered territories and slave labor. The story of how an automotive company with no aircraft manufacturing experience came to build half of all B-24 Liberator bombers produced during World War II begins in late 1940, when President Franklin Roosevelt's challenge to produce 50,000 aircraft annually forced American industry to fundamentally rethink how airplanes could be manufactured, because existing aircraft companies using traditional methods had no possibility of meeting production targets that exceeded everything they'd built since the Wright brothers' first flight at Kitty Hawk. Charles Sorensen traveled to San Diego in December 1940 to tour Consolidated Aircraft's facility, where the B-24 was being designed and initially produced, and what he observed shocked him because aircraft manufacturing in 1940 resembled automobile manufacturing from 3 decades earlier, before Ford had revolutionized production through the moving assembly line, with skilled craftsmen custom-fitting components to each individual aircraft in processes that required extensive handwork and produced bombers at rates measured in days or weeks per plane rather than planes per day or planes per hour. Consolidated was proud of achieving 1 B-24 every few days, considered this remarkable progress given the aircraft's complexity with its four Wright R1820 Cyclone engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower. Its 67-foot fuselage containing 450,000 parts held together by 360,000 rivets in 550 different sizes. Its ability to carry 8,000 pounds of bombs across 3,000 miles while defending itself, with 10 machine guns, operated by a crew that could number up to 11, depending on mission requirements. When Consolidated executives explained their production methods and timelines to Sorensen, he listened politely but incredulously, because everything he saw violated principles of mass production that Ford had perfected over 30 years. And when company president Reuben Fleet asked somewhat defensively how Sorensen would manufacture B-24s differently, Sorensen responded with characteristic confidence that he'd have an answer the next morning. He returned to his room at the Coronado Hotel and spent the night sketching on hotel stationery, breaking down the B-24 into major assemblies that could be produced separately and then brought together on a moving assembly line, calculating that it would require approximately 100,000 workers in a purpose-built facility, costing $200 million to achieve his goal of one completed bomber every hour. And by morning he had rough plans for what would become Willow Run, drawn entirely from figures he carried in his head and from manufacturing principles he'd spent decades implementing. The sketch he presented to Edsel Ford and senior company executives showed a factory unlike anything that existed in aircraft manufacturing, a facility organized around continuous flow production, where components moved through sequential operations and converged at assembly stations in precisely timed coordination, where standardization would replace custom fitting, where specialized machinery would perform operations that aircraft manufacturers accomplished through skilled hand labor, where the entire aircraft would be assembled indoors on a moving line rather than outdoors on static fixtures, as Consolidated did under the California sun. The construction of Willow Run represented an engineering and logistical achievement nearly as impressive as the production that would eventually occur there, because building a factory of unprecedented size in rural Michigan farmland while simultaneously training a workforce and developing manufacturing processes and managing complex relationships with government procurement offices and existing aircraft manufacturers created challenges that tested even Ford's organizational capabilities. Albert Kahn, the industrial architect who designed hundreds of factories for Ford and other automotive companies, created plans for a structure that would cover more land under a single roof than any building previously constructed, with the main assembly hall stretching over a mile in length and incorporating 4 large turntables that allowed the production line to make 90-degree turns and use space more efficiently than a straight line would have permitted. The site selection itself illustrated the complexity of wartime manufacturing, because Henry Ford owned farmland near Willow Run Creek that provided space for both the factory and an airfield where completed bombers could be tested and delivered, but the land straddled the boundary between Washtenaw County, where the factory would be built, and Wayne County, where the runways would be located, requiring easement negotiations with multiple jurisdictions and coordination between local governments that normally didn't work together on large projects. Construction began in early 1941, with thousands of workers pouring concrete foundations and erecting steel framework and installing the specialized equipment that would transform raw aluminum and thousands of components into finished bombers. And the speed with which this enormous facility took shape reflected both the urgency created by war and the efficiency of American construction industry that could mobilize resources and labor on scales that would have been impossible in peacetime. The factory's design incorporated innovations specifically intended to support continuous flow production, with raw materials and components entering at one end and moving through sequential operations that added value at each stage until completed bombers emerged at the other end. But achieving this flow required developing entirely new manufacturing techniques because aircraft production had never been organized this way, and nobody knew with certainty whether automobile industry methods would work for products as complex as 4-engine heavy bombers. The skepticism from aircraft industry was intense and sometimes hostile, because established manufacturers resented Ford's entry into their domain, questioned whether automotive engineers understood the precision and quality requirements that aircraft demanded, and predicted that Ford's mass production approach would produce inferior bombers that might endanger crews or fail in combat. And these concerns weren't entirely unfounded, because early production at Willow Run did reveal significant quality issues that required months of debugging and process refinement before the factory could deliver bombers that met military specifications. The workforce that Ford assembled at Willow Run reflected the dramatic social changes that war created in American society, as traditional automotive workers who would have staffed the factory in peacetime were increasingly unavailable due to military conscription, forcing Ford to recruit from populations that had been largely excluded from industrial employment during the Depression years, when jobs were scarce and employers could be selective about whom they hired. Women entered Willow Run in unprecedented numbers, eventually comprising over 40% of the workforce and performing every job from riveting to welding to operating the heavy machinery that assembled wing sections and fuselage components. And their presence challenged both traditional gender roles and union regulations that had assumed industrial work was men's domain and had negotiated contracts based on that assumption. The iconic Rosie the Riveter image that became synonymous with women's wartime industrial contribution had direct connections to Willow Run, with Rose Monroe, who worked at the plant, becoming one of the women. Identified as potential inspirations for the cultural symbol that represented millions of American women who entered factories to support the war effort while their husbands and sons fought overseas. The factory also attracted massive migration from the American South, with over 200,000 workers relocating from Appalachia and the Deep South to southeastern Michigan, seeking employment that paid wages far exceeding what they could earn in the struggling agricultural economies they left behind. And this migration created both opportunities and tensions, as rural Southerners, many of whom had never worked in factories or lived in urban environments, had to adapt to industrial discipline and to communities more diverse than the segregated small towns they'd come from. Some of these workers arrived so poor that they purchased their first pair of shoes upon reaching Michigan, having worked barefoot or in homemade footwear their entire lives before industrial wages made leather shoes affordable. And this detail captured both the desperate poverty that still characterized much of rural America in the early 1940s and the economic transformation that wartime production created by providing stable, well-paid employment to populations that had been economically marginalized throughout the Depression. The rapid expansion of the workforce created housing crises because 30,000 workers couldn't be accommodated in existing communities around Ypsilanti and Ann Arbor, and the federal government had to construct emergency housing, including dormitories and trailer parks, to shelter workers who would otherwise have been homeless, despite having good jobs. And these hastily built communities became their own social worlds with their own dynamics and tensions as people from different backgrounds and regions tried to coexist under crowded conditions, while working exhausting shifts that left little energy for the kind of community building that might have eased social friction. The technical challenges of mass-producing B-24 bombers while meeting military quality standards and adapting to constant design changes that the Army Air Forces insisted upon created nearly 2 years of frustration before Willow Run achieved the production efficiency that Sorensen had promised. And this struggle revealed both the limits of applying automotive methods to aircraft manufacturing and the remarkable problem-solving capacity that American engineers and workers demonstrated when facing obstacles that seemed insurmountable. The first B-24 emerged from Willow Run in September 1942, nearly 2 years after construction began, and it represented a milestone that had required overcoming countless difficulties, from training workers who'd never built aircraft to developing tooling and fixtures that could handle aluminum aircraft components with the precision that steel automotive parts demanded, from managing supply chains that coordinated delivery of hundreds of thousands of components from suppliers scattered across the country to satisfying military inspectors who scrutinized every aspect of production and rejected bombers that didn't meet specifications that were themselves constantly evolving, as combat experience revealed needed improvements. The production rate during late 1942 and early 1943 was painfully slow, sometimes just one aircraft per month when Sorensen had promised one per hour. And critics within the aviation industry and within government seized on these delays as evidence that Ford had been arrogant to believe automobile manufacturers could successfully enter aircraft production. And congressional committees investigated Willow Run to determine whether the enormous investment in the facility had been wasted on a project that would never deliver the promised results. The problems were both technical and organizational, stemming from Ford's initial insistence on making substantial design changes to the B-24 that would make it more suitable for mass production, even though these changes required extensive testing and approval from military authorities who were understandably conservative about modifying an aircraft design while it was entering combat service, and from the Army Air Force's continuous modifications to specifications as combat reports from North Africa and Europe identified deficiencies that needed correction or improvements that would increase effectiveness. Ford's Charles Sorensen complained bitterly that mass production required fixed designs and that continuous changes disrupted assembly lines and required retooling that cost both time and money. But military authorities responded that they couldn't freeze designs when combat experience revealed that aircraft needed better armor or different armament or improved systems. And this tension between production efficiency and combat effectiveness created friction that wouldn't be fully resolved until 1943, when both sides reached accommodations that allowed design modifications to be implemented at modification centers after bombers left Willow Run rather than disrupting the production line itself. The breakthrough came gradually through hundreds of small improvements in processes and tooling and training, through Ford engineers learning to work with aluminum, which behaved differently from the steel they were accustomed to handling in automotive production, through workers developing the skills and experience that allowed them to assemble aircraft components with the precision that aviation required, and through managers learning to coordinate the complex logistics that kept components flowing to assembly stations in the precise sequence and timing that continuous production demanded. By mid-1943, the pieces had finally fallen into place, and Willow Run began accelerating toward the production rates that Sorensen had promised, transforming from an embarrassing boondoggle that critics used as evidence of Ford's overreach into a vindication of mass production principles that would eventually produce more B-24 Liberators than all other manufacturers combined and demonstrate that American industrial capacity, operating at full mobilization, could overwhelm any enemy, regardless of how efficiently that enemy organized its own production or how ruthlessly it exploited conquered territories and enslaved populations. The production statistics from the second half of 1943 and throughout 1944 tell a story of exponential growth that reflected both the learning curve as workers and managers gained experience and the resolution of technical problems that had plagued early production, with monthly output climbing from single digits in late 1942 to 31 aircraft in March 1943, then to 75 in June, then to 104 in September, then to 150 in December, and accelerating further in 1944 when the factory hit its stride and began producing numbers that matched Sorensen's original ambitious promises. By March 1944, Willow Run was completing 350 B-24s monthly, and in April the factory achieved 453 bombers in a month that had 468 working hours, finally reaching the goal of one bomber per hour that critics had dismissed as impossible fantasy when Sorensen first articulated it. The peak came in August 1944, when Willow Run delivered 432 B-24s in a single month, and across the entire year, the factory produced 56% of all Liberators, built by all manufacturers combined, with Willow Run's annual output exceeding what the entire American aircraft industry had produced in any single year before Pearl Harbor. These production achievements translated directly into military capability that shaped the strategic bombing campaigns against Germany and Japan, because the 8th Air Force and 15th Air Force operating from Britain and Italy and the various air forces operating in the Pacific required constant replacement of bombers lost to enemy action and operational accidents and simple mechanical failures that were inevitable when aircraft flew hundreds of hours under combat conditions that stressed every component. Beyond what peacetime operations would demand, the mathematics of attrition warfare in the air was brutal and unforgiving. Heavy bomber missions over Germany in 1943 and 1944 sometimes resulted in loss rates exceeding 5% per mission. And with bomber groups flying multiple missions weekly, these losses would have quickly destroyed Allied air forces if replacement aircraft weren't available in quantities that allowed units to maintain strength despite continuous casualties. Willow Run's production provided the reserve capacity that allowed strategic bombing to continue and eventually succeed despite losses that would have forced operational pauses if bombers had been scarce. And this industrial backup enabled the tactical doctrine that wore down German fighter defenses and oil production and transportation networks through sustained pressure that Germany couldn't match because, while German factories could produce excellent aircraft, they couldn't produce them in quantities sufficient to replace losses faster than American factories could produce bombers to replace their losses, creating an attrition spiral where American numerical superiority compounded over time until German defensive capabilities collapsed under the weight of attacks they couldn't prevent or adequately respond to given their dwindling resources and pilot training programs that had been degraded by fuel shortages and the loss of experienced instructors killed in combat. The human stories from Willow Run capture both the remarkable achievements and the significant costs of this industrial mobilization because the workers who built bombers at unprecedented rates were themselves dealing with dislocations and hardships created by rapid social change and the demands of wartime production that pushed people beyond what peacetime employment would have required or what workers would have accepted if they hadn't believed they were contributing to a cause larger than their individual interests or economic security. Rose Will Munro, who became one of several women associated with the Rosie the Riveter image, had come to Michigan from Kentucky, following her husband's death, seeking better opportunities for herself and her two young daughters, and she found work at Willow Run where she drove rivets into B-24 fuselages, earning wages that allowed her to support her family independently at a time when widows with children often had few options beyond remarriage or dependence on relatives. Her story repeated across thousands of women who found economic independence and personal dignity through industrial work that utilized capabilities they'd always possessed, but that peacetime society had channeled into domestic roles or low-paid service work that offered neither the compensation nor the recognition that factory employment provided. And many of these women would later describe their time at Willow Run as transformative experiences that changed their self-perception and their expectations about what roles women could fill in American society. Though these transformations would face significant resistance after the war when returning, veterans wanted their jobs back, and social pressure mounted for women to return to domestic roles and leave industrial work to men who needed employment to support families. The African American workers who migrated from the South seeking factory jobs encountered both opportunities and obstacles, because while Willow Run paid equal wages regardless of race and offered employment that was far more remunerative and dignified than the sharecropping and domestic service that characterized most black employment in the Depression-era South, the factory and the surrounding communities maintained various forms of discrimination that limited where black workers could live and how they were treated both inside and outside the plant. The United Auto Workers Union that represented Willow Run workers had progressive racial policies compared to many unions of the era and fought against some discriminatory practices, but they also had to navigate the prejudices of white workers, many of whom came from Southern backgrounds where racial segregation was taken for granted, and who resisted working alongside black colleagues or especially working under black supervisors if any were promoted to leadership positions. These racial tensions occasionally erupted into conflicts that disrupted production and required management intervention, and they reflected broader patterns of racial discrimination that characterized American society during this period, even as the war was supposedly being fought for democratic principles and human dignity that the rhetoric surrounding the conflict emphasized, but that domestic practices frequently contradicted. The physical demands of factory work at the pace that Willow Run required took significant tolls on workers' bodies and family lives, with the 9-hour shifts on moving assembly lines creating fatigue and repetitive stress injuries that left workers exhausted and sometimes permanently damaged, and with the demands of production schedules that couldn't accommodate family emergencies or illness or the simple human need for rest and recovery that peacetime employment might have recognized, but that wartime imperatives overrode in the name of military necessity. The accident rates at Willow Run reflected the hazards of industrial work performed at high speed under pressure by workers who were often inadequately trained or who were too exhausted to maintain the vigilance that safety required. And while the factory had safety programs and protocols, the sheer pace of production meant that corners were sometimes cut and risks were taken that resulted in injuries and occasionally deaths that were accepted as unfortunate but inevitable costs of the war effort. The personal sacrifices these workers made weren't comparable to the sacrifices of soldiers fighting overseas, and nobody claimed they were, but the distinction between home front and battlefront was less absolute than might appear, because the workers building bombers were contributing directly to military operations in ways that were causally connected to combat outcomes, and many workers at Willow Run had family members serving in the military, and understood that the bombers they built might be flown by their sons or brothers or husbands, creating personal stakes in quality and production that went beyond simple patriotic duty or economic self-interest. The strategic impact of Willow Run's production extended beyond simply providing bombers in sufficient quantity to sustain strategic bombing campaigns, because the factory's success demonstrated principles of industrial organization and mass production that influenced how the United States would approach military procurement and production in future conflicts, and that contributed to broader understanding of how industrial capacity functioned as a form of military power that complemented and in some ways exceeded the importance of traditional military capabilities like troop strength or weapons technology. The concept of the arsenal of democracy that President Roosevelt articulated in December 1940 found its fullest expression in facilities like Willow Run, where American industry mobilized to produce weapons at scales that no other nation could match. And this industrial mobilization represented a form of grand strategy that recognized that modern warfare between industrialized nations would be won not primarily through superior tactics or strategy or even technology, but through superior production capacity that could generate and sustain military forces larger than enemies could destroy faster than they could be replaced. The contrast between American and German aircraft production illustrated this dynamic with brutal clarity. Germany produced approximately 34,000 aircraft of all types in 1943 when its production peaked, while the United States produced over 85,000 aircraft that same year, and this roughly 3-to-1 advantage in production translated into military advantages that compounded over time as American air forces could sustain operations and replace losses while German air forces were ground down through attrition. They couldn't recover from given their industrial limitations and the strategic bombing that targeted their production facilities. The B-24 Liberators that emerged from Willow Run participated in virtually every major air campaign of the war's final 2 years, flying missions over Germany from bases in Britain and Italy, conducting anti-submarine patrols over the Atlantic that helped win the Battle of the Atlantic by making it impossible for U-boats to operate on the surface where they were vulnerable to air attack, flying supply missions over the Himalayan hump route that kept Chinese nationalist forces supplied after Japan conquered Burma and cut the Burma Road, attacking Japanese shipping and installations across the Pacific Theater, and eventually participating in the strategic bombing campaign against Japan that complemented the naval blockade and island-hopping campaign that brought American forces ever closer to the Japanese home islands. The specific contribution of Willow Run's bombers to any individual battle or campaign cannot be precisely Calculated, because aircraft from multiple production sources were mixed together in operational units and because the Liberators' effectiveness depended on numerous factors beyond just their availability. But the aggregate impact is undeniable. Without Willow Run's production, the strategic bombing, campaigns that destroyed German and Japanese industrial capacity, and transportation networks and oil refineries could not have been sustained at the intensity and duration that eventually proved decisive. And the course of the war would have been different in ways that are impossible to specify, but that almost certainly would have extended the conflict's duration and increased its cost in lives and resources on all sides. The legacy of Willow Run extended far beyond its wartime production achievements to influence American manufacturing and industrial organization throughout the latter half of the 20th century, and to provide lessons about both the possibilities and limitations of applying mass production principles to complex products that had traditionally been manufactured through craft production methods. The factory's success validated the fundamental principles of continuous flow manufacturing and standardization that Henry Ford had pioneered in automotive production, demonstrating that these principles could be adapted to products far more complex than automobiles if sufficient engineering effort was invested in analyzing production processes and developing appropriate tooling and training. And this validation encouraged application of mass production methods to other industries, including electronics and consumer goods, where craft production had persisted because manufacturers believed their products were too complex or required too much precision for assembly line production to work effectively. The Willow Run experience also revealed limitations and costs of mass production that were less visible in automotive manufacturing, but became apparent when applied to aircraft, including the tendency toward quality problems when production rates were pushed too aggressively before processes were fully debugged. The difficulty of accommodating design changes in systems optimized for producing standardized products, the workforce management challenges created by rapid expansion and high turnover, and the employment of workers without previous industrial experience, and the social disruptions caused by concentrating tens of thousands of workers in locations without adequate housing and community infrastructure to support them. After the war ended in August 1945, Willow Run faced the immediate challenge of converting from military to civilian production, or closing entirely because demand for bombers disappeared overnight once Japan surrendered and military contracts were cancelled. And Ford initially attempted to use the facility for automobile production, but found that the factory's layout optimized for bomber assembly didn't adapt well to automotive production, and that maintaining such an enormous facility was economically untenable without the wartime production volumes that had justified its construction. The factory was eventually sold to Kaiser Frazer Corporation, which attempted to manufacture automobiles there with limited success before selling it to General Motors, which used portions of the facility for various purposes over subsequent decades, while other sections were demolished or repurposed, and today only small portions of the original structure remain, with most of the site redeveloped for other uses, including a portion that houses part of the GM transmission plant and another portion that has been preserved as a museum commemorating Willow Run's contribution to the war effort. The workers who built bombers at Willow Run during the war scattered after production ended, with many returning to their original homes in Appalachia and the South, while others remained in Michigan and transitioned to automotive industry employment or other post-war opportunities. And the women who had comprised such a large percentage of the workforce faced particular difficulties as social pressure and economic displacement pushed many of them out of industrial employment and back into domestic roles or lower paid service work, despite their proven capabilities, and despite many women's desires to continue the independent working lives they'd established during the war. The African-American workers who'd migrated north seeking opportunity found that while they'd gained economic foothold in industrial cities, they continued facing discrimination in housing and employment and social interactions that the war's rhetoric about democracy and equality hadn't eliminated, and that would require another 2 decades of civil rights activism to begin seriously addressing through legal and social change. The story of Willow Run ultimately reveals essential truths about industrial warfare and American society during World War II that extend beyond the specific achievement of building bombers at unprecedented rates, speaks to broader questions about how democratic societies mobilize for total war and about the relationship between industrial capacity and military power, and about the human costs and social changes that such mobilization creates. Charles Sorensen's vision of mass-producing heavy bombers through automotive manufacturing techniques proved correct, despite years of skepticism and despite significant problems during implementation, vindicated the Ford production system's fundamental principles, and demonstrated that American industrial capacity, properly organized, could achieve manufacturing feats that seemed impossible to observers conditioned by peacetime production paradigms and by assumptions about what was feasible that were based on past performance rather than theoretical understanding of what properly designed systems could accomplish. The factory that emerged from Michigan farmland and produced over 8,000 B-24 Liberators between 1942 and 1945 represented more than just manufacturing achievement, represented instead a manifestation of American industrial power that proved decisive in determining the war's outcome, because it enabled military operations that would have been impossible without the production volumes that Willow Run and other American factories generated. The B-24 Liberators themselves were not the best bombers of the war by many measures, lacking the high-altitude performance of the B-29 Superfortress and the rugged survivability that B-17 Flying Fortress crews appreciated, and suffering from various design compromises that combat experience revealed, but that couldn't be fully corrected given the need to maintain production continuity. But their sheer numbers compensated for individual limitations, because having adequate bombers to sustain operations proved more strategically valuable than having smaller numbers of superior aircraft that couldn't generate the sortie rates necessary to achieve the sustained pressure that strategic bombing required to succeed. The workers who built these bombers contributed to military victory in ways that were both direct and profound, creating weapons that crews would fly into combat, where the quality of assembly and the reliability of components could mean the difference between completing missions and being shot down, between crews surviving and dying, between bombs hitting targets and being jettisoned uselessly over ocean or countryside. And this direct connection between factory work and combat outcomes created a relationship between home front and battlefront that was more immediate and consequential than the sometimes abstract, patriotic appeals that characterized civilian war mobilization in other contexts. When the last B-24 rolled off the Willow Run assembly line in June 1945, 1 month before Japan surrendered and 2 months before production officially ended, the workers who watched that final bomber emerge from the factory they'd spent years building and perfecting could take legitimate pride in having contributed to victory in the most destructive conflict in human history, could understand that while their contribution wasn't equivalent to the sacrifices of soldiers who'd fought and died overseas, it had been essential and meaningful, and had demonstrated that American industrial workers, properly organized and motivated, could produce weapons at scales that no enemy could match or overcome. The physical factory may have largely disappeared in subsequent decades, as the economic rationale for maintaining such an enormous single-purpose facility evaporated with the end of wartime production, but the lessons and legacy of Willow Run persisted in American manufacturing practices and in understanding of industrial mobilization, and in the memory of workers who'd experienced the remarkable achievement of building one bomber every hour and had proven that Charles Sorensen's seemingly impossible promise made in a California hotel room in December 1940 was not only feasible, but represented the beginning of an industrial achievement that would help determine the war's outcome, and would demonstrate that in conflicts between industrial powers, victory ultimately belonged to nations that could convert productive capacity into military capability faster and more efficiently than their enemies, that could sustain losses and continue fighting because their factories could replace destroyed weapons more quickly than enemies could destroy them, and that could mobilize civilian workers to contribute directly to military operations, in ways that blurred traditional distinctions between combatants and non-combatants and created forms of warfare where factory production lines became as decisive as battle lines and where the question of who would win was ultimately determined not primarily by who fought more bravely or more skillfully, but by who could build more weapons faster and sustain production longer than enemies could sustain resistance. The veterans who flew Willow Run's B-24s in combat and survived to return home carried with them complex feelings about the aircraft they'd depended on for survival through dozens of missions over defended targets where German fighters and flak batteries tried to kill them every time they crossed into enemy airspace, and many developed affection for these bombers despite their flaws and vulnerabilities, because the liberators had brought them home when they might have died, had carried them through situations where mechanical reliability mattered as much as luck or skill, and had represented the tangible connection between their combat service and the industrial might of the nation they fought for that made their missions possible. The reunions that occurred in later decades between Willow Run workers and B-24 crew members created powerful, emotional moments where the people who built the bombers could meet the people who flew them, and both groups could acknowledge their complementary contributions to victory, with workers expressing gratitude that their labor had helped protect airmen by building aircraft as well as they possibly could, given the pressure and pace of production, and veterans expressing appreciation for the industrial effort that had kept bombers available even when losses were devastating, and that had demonstrated America's commitment to winning through whatever means necessary, including organizing industrial production on scales that enemies couldn't approach. Charles Sorensen lived until 1968, long enough to see the Cold War transform American defense industry, and to witness how the manufacturing principles he'd championed at Willow Run influenced subsequent military production, including jets and missiles and eventually space vehicles, and in his final years, he reflected on Willow Run as perhaps his greatest achievement, despite a career spanning 5 decades at Ford and including responsibility for implementing the original Model T assembly line, because Willow Run had proven under the most demanding circumstances possible that mass production principles could adapt to new challenges and could accomplish what experts dismissed as impossible if engineers approached problems with sufficient creativity and determination. The site where the factory stood became gradually less recognizable as original. Structures were demolished or repurposed, and as the surrounding area developed, from farmland into suburban sprawl that erased most traces of the wartime landscape. But small sections were preserved, including a portion that became the Yankee Air Museum, where visitors could see remaining sections of the assembly line and learn about the factory's history and understand that this unassuming location in southeastern Michigan had once been the site of manufacturing achievements that helped determine the outcome of history's most destructive conflict. The women who worked at Willow Run and who were pushed out of industrial employment after the war carried complicated feelings about their wartime experiences throughout their lives, taking pride in having contributed to victory and having proven their capabilities in roles that peacetime society had denied them, while also resenting the post-war return to limited opportunities and domestic expectations that wasted talents they'd developed and demonstrated during the war years. And many of these women would become supporters of feminist movements in subsequent decades because their Willow Run experience had shown them possibilities for women's roles that 1950s American society attempted to suppress or deny. The transformation that Willow Run represented in American industrial organization and in understanding of how manufacturing capability functioned as military power influenced not just subsequent wars but also peacetime economic competition as the lesson that properly organized industrial systems could achieve previously impossible production rates, informed how American companies approached manufacturing challenges and how they competed against international rivals in industries from electronics to automobiles to consumer goods where mass production advantages determined market success. The legacy of that mile-long assembly line where bombers emerged every hour during the war's peak production period endured not in physical structures that mostly disappeared but in the proven demonstration that American industrial Capacity properly mobilized could overwhelm any challenge through sheer productive power. That workers given adequate tools and training and organization could accomplish manufacturing feats that seemed impossible, and that the connection between factory floors and battlefields in modern warfare meant that building weapons faster and better than enemies could build theirs represented a form of military power as decisive as anything that happened in actual combat, proving that Charles Sorensen's sketch drawn on hotel stationery in December 1940 had captured an essential truth about industrial warfare that would shape how conflicts were fought and won throughout the remainder of the 20th century and beyond.